Okay. Yes, I just, for purposes of announcements, there are none. So we have to start because there are no announcements. Although I will say that I still have some copies of that Chesterton on Shakespeare book that you can still get, and some of those Get Louis Stiggs novels. So I just do want to mention that those are still available. So. All right, so it's time to abandon all hopelessness, everyone. I am very, very privileged to announce our next speaker, Mr. Charles Dickens.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning. I must say, I have not been to Rochester, New York since 1842. You might say that I'm back by popular demand. My first trip to Rochester and to the United States was quite an adventure for me. In fact, many of you might say that I am a... oh, by the way, you're getting little handouts. These will be things that you'll choose to have me talk about later. But before we get there, I have to let you know, my first trip to the United States was the first, you might call, British invasion that was experienced by your culture, your so-called culture. Because when I was here, I could not walk down a street or turn a corner without 100 multitudes following me. Indeed, I could not drink a glass of water without 100 people peering down my throat when I opened my mouth to take it in. I went to a barber to be groomed, and when I did, after he cut my hair, he tried to sell locks of it. This is true. I was what you might call a rock star. Indeed, I was one of the first tremendously popular people. And in the 1840s, America loved Charles Dickens. But it was not a reciprocal love. Indeed, I did not quite feel all that warmly affectionate toward the citizens of the United States and their culture. After I returned to England, I wrote that the state of New York was one of the most despicable places I'd ever visited in my life. But this was before I went to the Midwest. At first, I thought the Midwesterners were overbearing, boastful, vulgar, uncivil, insensitive, and above all, acquisitive, meaning greedy. But that was merely my first impression. Then I made the mistake of eating with them. I wrote that they were so many fellow animals who stripped social sacraments of everything but the mere satisfaction of natural cravings, stuffing things into their mouths. And I must say this, what on earth is the matter with your politicians? I'm quite serious. I think that there is probably no more unlettered, unlearned, despicable, untrustworthy, uncultured, and uncivilized human being than the current President of the United States, John Tyler. How on earth did he get elected? Oh, I think I know. As I wrote, he was elected in the usual way. Despicable trickery at elections, underhanded tamperings with public officers, cowardly attacks upon opponents with scurrilous newspapers for shields and hired pens for daggers. Nothing but venom, poison, mudslinging, and the use of the press to confuse and bully the American people. I wrote this 175 years ago. As you can see, the more things change, the more they stay the same. But some things have changed here in America. Many people say to me, Mr. Dickens, things are so much better now. For one thing, hardly anyone smokes anymore. Isn't that wonderful? And I reply, I only wish they would smoke more rather than chewing and spitting. How on earth did this detestable custom get started? As I wrote in my American notes, in all the public places of America, this filthy custom is recognized. In the courts of law, the judge has his spittoon, the witness his, the crier his, the prisoner his, the jury is provided with theirs, the spectators with theirs, and in Washington, D.C., everyone exudes their quids or plugs, as they are called, by spitting into national spittoons so that they do not spit at the base of the marble columns. Everyone was chewing and spitting, especially in Washington, D.C. However, I suppose, considering what now comes out of Washington, masses of black spit would be an improvement. Yes, indeed, more than that, you see, I'm also under the impression that I misjudged your country. Because a friend of mine said to me, Mr. Dickens, you're being unfair. He said, you have never met the American gentleman. And I said, God forgive you for putting two such words together. That's true. But I did say something more serious, because I'm not merely a comedian. I wrote, I do fear that the heaviest blow ever dealt at liberty will be dealt by this country in its failure of its example on the earth. You have been built to be an exemplar. You have been built for the cause of liberty and fraternity and equality. You are the great light that the rest of the world looks to as an ideal. And if you fail at that, it will be the greatest failure of any social institution on earth. Now, of course, when I returned to America later in my life as an older man, by then I had softened a bit and I had actually become a friend of America. That might be hard to imagine, considering some of the things I said, but you must all know that friendship between America and England is founded on reciprocal ridicule. That's a great line, but it's not one of mine. That was written by a certain G.K. Chesterton. Perhaps you've heard of him. I've become very fond of Chesterton. He also said, he made many observations in his book, which is that book on America. What I saw in America, he made many observations of the difference between our two cultures. He wrote, quote, all good Americans wish to fight the representatives they have chosen. All good Englishmen wish to forget the representatives they've chosen. The thing about Chesterton is, now that I have time to read him, he really is remarkable. Oh, speaking of all the time I now have on my hands, perhaps some of you are wondering what I would say about the afterlife. Well, I won't say much. I will say very little now, more at the end of my lecture. Of course, later this afternoon we have Dante Alighieri. He talks of nothing else. It's true. And yet I will at least say this much, and I will quote myself from my novel, The Old Curiosity Shop. Death doesn't change us more than life. Think about that. Life is what changes us. Life is what challenges us. Perhaps there's more change and challenge after we die, but let's go back to something else, something that I experienced while still alive. You see, I am actually a complex man. No one understood that perhaps better than G.K. Chesterton. I died when I was quite young. 58 was my age. And yet even then, I had lived a life of intense activity, of intense creative output, of intense satisfaction, and intense dissatisfaction. As I wrote to my closest friend the year I died, why is it that with poor David Copperfield, a sense comes over me, crushing on me when I fall into low spirits, a sense of one happiness have missed in life. A sense of one friend that I have never made. I don't know if you understand what I'm talking about. I had many great friends in my day. I had much wonderful activity, and yet there was something always beyond, especially with intimacy and friendship. As loyal as my friends were to me, as much as I loved them, I seemed to be missing one person in my life. I seemed to be missing one woman in particular. And yet I had so many wonderful relations with women and so many disturbing ones. Beginning with Maria Beadnell, my first love. I proposed to her and she turned me down. I never quite recovered from that. It affected me the rest of my life. And most memorably, Mary Hogarth, my wife's sister. She was the most incredibly pure and intelligent, pretty, sweet, and spiritual creature I'd ever met. She lived with us after I got married, my sister-in-law in the same house, the house in which she died at the age of 17. She had a sudden illness, died of it. We found how sick she was overnight. Within 24 hours, she was gone. I held her in my arms, and her last words on this earth were of me. After she died, I took the ring from her lifeless finger and put it on my own. I wore that ring the rest of my life. And I asked to be buried in the grave beside Mary, my sister-in-law. I never forgot her. I always remembered her. And later in my life, in a way, she returned to me. But there was one other woman. My friends, there may be things in your lives that you don't want people to know about. There may be things you try to keep hidden. After I died, one of the most embarrassing and shameful facts of my life was hidden for many, many years. But there is nothing hidden that will not be revealed, nothing in the darkness that will not come to light. We are all called to come to the light, and somehow our truth is revealed, if not while we're alive, and at some point after we die. I fell desperately in love with a woman named Ellen Ternan, my own little Nell. Nellie, we called her. I was 45, and she was 18. I think you call this a midlife crisis. I called it a passionate love affair, truly based on love. By then, my marriage was in a shambles, and I did get divorced. Nellie was my kept woman on the continent while I was in London. We had a child, a boy who died in infancy. And I'm afraid to say that after my death, many years later, when Nellie was fully grown, she deeply regretted our relationship and our intimacy. Her son, whom she had with her husband once she married, when he grew up after his mother died and found out the truth of her relationship with me, from that moment on, he never wished to discuss his mother with anyone else again. And I'm sorry to say that my own favorite daughter, Katie, said in a 1929 interview, and friends, you must understand, these things eventually come to the light for all of us, though this is difficult for me to read. Katie said, "My father was a wicked man, a very wicked man. My poor mother was afraid of him, never allowed to express an opinion. This affair with Nellie brought out all that was worst and weakest in him. He did not care a damn what happened to any of us. Nothing could surpass the misery and unhappiness of our home." Now, she was at that time herself an old lady, and perhaps the bitterness had been eating at her. But that is what she said. You see, G.K. Chesterton manages to allude to this darkness of mine, to this failure, to this tragedy. If you are to be perceived for who you really are, if not by the very face of God, at least we hope that we will be perceived by one who understands us and who loves us. And Chesterton, I believe, understood and loved me. For he wrote that Charles Dickens' private life consisted of one tragedy and 10,000 comedies. By one tragedy, I mean one real and rending moral tragedy, the failure of his marriage. I had lost my dear sister-in-law. I had lost some of my own children. However, Chesterton also says the end of life is not tragic, like the end of love. He understood ordinary things, and he understood me, an ordinary man, and he understood us and our ordinary failures. I'm also told that marriage is something that is failing at an extraordinary rate in an ordinary way. At least you think of it as an ordinary thing, the consistent failure of marriage. That my story, leaving my wife and my many children for a much younger woman, has become quite normal and something that makes you almost yawn, which is indeed a great tragedy. But Chesterton understood the ordinary things, and he understood marriage. He wrote concerning an ordinary and happy marriage that a man and a woman cannot live together without having against each other a kind of everlasting joke. Each has discovered that the other is a fool, but a great fool. Don't you see? This is what I understood in all my writings. The joke. We are both not what we wish to be and claim to be, but we are also much more. We are fools, and we are great fools. And only your spouse knows that best of all about you. And in his book on me, Charles Dickens, one of his early books, one of his lesser known books, one of his most brilliant books, he writes more about me and my character. Now, I don't know if you know this book, but really you must. You must read it, because after all, it's supposed to be a work of literary criticism. And who wants to read literary criticism? I mean, really. But it's not that. It's a biography, though it does not claim to be. But more than a biography and more than literary criticism, it's a deep insight not only into me and my writings, but into life itself and what I have to show about it and what he perceives. You may be wondering, am I a wicked man, as my favorite daughter said of me? Was I a despot in the home? Was I a bully? Was I a patriarch? Was I a philanderer? Was I all the things that you would love to hate? Was that Charles Dickens? Or was I a great artist, a great passionate lover of the poor and of humanity, a great social reformer? Or was I a fool, but a great fool? I'm going to read to you the longest quotation I have from the book Charles Dickens. I'll try to spice it up so you don't get bored. But if you pay attention, you won't get bored. He says, and this really sums me up, my life domestically and my life publicly. He says, Dickens also had a bad quality, not intrinsically very terrible, which he allowed to wreck his life. He also had a small weakness that could sometimes become stronger than all his strengths. His selfishness was not, it need hardly be said, the selfishness of Gradgrind. He was particularly compassionate and liberal, nor was it in the least the selfishness of Skimpole. He was entirely self-dependent, industrious, and dignified. His selfishness is wholly a selfishness of the nerves. Whatever his whim or the temperature of the instant told him to do, it must be done. He was the type of man who would break a window if it would not open and give him air. And his weakness had, by the time that we speak of, led to the breach between himself and his wife, which he was too exasperated to to let heal with time. Everything must be done in the instant for Dickens. Everything must be put right and put right at once with him. If London bored him, he must go to the continent at once. If the continent bored him, he must come back to London at once. If the day was too noisy, the whole household must be quiet. If the night was too quiet, the whole household must wake up. Above all, he had the supreme character of the domestic despot, that his good temper was, if possible, more despotic than his bad temper. When he was miserable, as he often was, poor fellow, they, his family, only had to listen to his railings. But when he was happy, they had to listen to his novels. All this, which was mainly mere excitability, did not seem to amount to much. It did not in the least mean that he had ceased to be a clean-living and kind-hearted and quite honest man. But there was this evil about it, that he did not resist this weakness in the least. I was of the artistic temperament. I gave myself over to this mere character flaw. I did not resist it in the least. It separated him and his wife. A mere silly trick of temperament did everything that the blackest misconduct could have done. A random argument, a window not shut, getting on one another's nerves, had more evil consequence in my marriage than the blast of bigamy or adultery. He and I understood the great challenge of everyday life and the ordinary world, of families, of characters, of who we are as human beings. And here's what I would like you to do. I have taken 35 of the best quotes from Charles Dickens by G.K. Chesterton. I probably can't get through them all. If I did, it would be nigh on to Judgment Day, when Mrs. Flight would finally be happy. What I would like you to do is, based upon the topics, suggest which quote you would like me to read. I will not only read the quote by Chesterton about me, Dickens, I will try to explain it and unpack it for you. And then I will end my talk by telling of the most remarkable event in all of my life. Let's begin with this. Raise your hand if any of those topics appeal to you. Yes, ma'am? Number 12. And what is number 12? Oh, Dickens and Catholics. Isn't it interesting that you want to begin with that? Dickens and Catholics. In reaching the period of the publication of Pickwick, we reach this sudden apotheosis of Dickens. He means when Pickwick was published, I became a rock star. That's what he means. Godlike, the great leader of the literary world and the culture of my day. Henceforward, he filled the literary world in a way hard to imagine. Fragments of that huge fashion remain in our daily language. In the talk of every trade or public question are embedded the wrecks of that enormous religion. Men give out the airs of Dickens without even opening his books. What he's saying is, people will say, oh, this is like Scrooge. Oh, yes. Well, you know how in A Tale of Two Cities, even though they don't really know and they've never read it, he's saying that I infused the culture. People knew me and my characters, even if they hadn't read me. Men give out the airs of Dickens without ever opening his books, just as Catholics can live in a tradition of Christianity without ever having looked at the New Testament. You see, humor is based on truth. Another suggestion. Yes, sir.
Reality and madness.
Which one is that?
17.
17. Reality and madness. The lunatic is the man who lives in a small world but thinks it is a large one. He is the man who lives in 1/10 of the truth and thinks it is the whole. The madman cannot conceive any cosmos outside a certain tale or conspiracy or vision. Hence, the more clearly we see the world divided into Saxons and non-Saxons, into our splendid selves and the rest, the more certain we may be that we are slowly and quietly going mad. The more plain and satisfying our state appears, the more we may know that we are living in an unreal world. For this real world is not satisfying. Well, you see, you take a little risk. When you suggest these topics, you take a risk. You have no idea the weight of truth that is about to hit you. You see, it's true. We would rather live in our own little worlds of unreality. We would rather, even if our unreality is over there, we would rather save the poor in Africa and raise funds than raise our own children, as one of my characters did. Our reality, as fantastic as it might be, is satisfying, much more satisfying than the real reality outside of our own fictitious limitations. All right then, who's next? Yes, sir?
Number 34, Evil and the Vitality of War.
34, Evil and the Vitality of War. One of the things Chesterton wrote was that this day and age has made the tremendous mistake of separating warring from wooing, that there is an intimate connection between fighting and love, that the soldier does not fight because he hates what's in front of him, but because he loves what's behind him. And that this great romantic adventure of St. Paul and the dragon is out of love for the lady threatened by the dragon. He also says in his book about me, against such an aching vacuum of joyless approval, there is only one antidote: a sudden and pugnacious belief in positive evil. What he's describing is this sort of ennui. Perhaps you know it better in your day than I did in mine, when people say, oh, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter what you believe, it doesn't matter what you do. I mean, it all comes to the same thing. Just, find some pleasure. Don't judge one another. Find a way to live where, you might be bored, but at least it's somewhat pleasant. You have diversions. You become inured to the romance of life. He says the antidote to this is belief in positive evil. This world can be made beautiful again by beholding it as a battlefield. When we have defined and isolated the evil thing, the colors come back into everything else. When evil things have become evil, good things in a blazing apocalypse become good. There are some men who are dreary because they do not believe in God, but there are many others who are dreary because they do not believe in the devil. The grass grows green again when we believe in the devil. The roses grow red again when we believe in the devil. No man was more filled with the sense of this bellicose basis of all cheerfulness than Dickens. He knew very well the essential truth that the true optimist can only continue an optimist so long as he is discontented. For the full value of this life can only be got by fighting. The violent take it by storm, and if we have accepted everything, we have missed something. War. This life of ours is a very enjoyable fight, but a very miserable truce. Now, when we blur the distinction between sin and virtue, right and wrong, justice and injustice, darkness and light, when we call light darkness and darkness light, woe unto us, for we have lost that pugnancy, that taste, that pungent distinction between life and death, between what is worth defending and dying for and what is a mere interminable boredom. Next. next. Yes, ma'am?
Number 16, The Femininity and Sanity of Dickens.
We have a woman who wants me to read about the femininity and sanity of Dickens. Isn't that interesting? Well, here we go. I'm told that this is a contentious subject these days. The difference between men and women, or the non-difference, however you choose to view it. Dickens, I repeat, had common sense and uncommon sensibility. That is to say, the proportion of interests in him was about the same as that of any ordinary man, but he felt all of them more excitedly. This is a distinction not easy for us to keep in mind, because we hear today chiefly of two types. The dull man, who likes ordinary things mildly, and the extraordinary man, who likes extraordinary things wildly. Those are the two types we hear of. But Dickens liked quiet, ordinary things. He merely made an extraordinary fuss about them. His excitement was something like an epileptic fit. But it must not be confused with the fury of the man of one idea or of one line of ideas. He had the excess of the eccentric, but not the defects, the narrowness. Even when he raved like a maniac, he did not rave like a monomaniac. He had no particular spot of sensibility or spot of insensibility. He was merely a normal man, minus a normal self-control. Yes. He had no special point of material pain or repugnance, like Ruskin's horror of steam and iron, or Mr. Bernard Shaw's permanent irritation against romantic love. He was annoyed at the ordinary annoyances, only he was more annoyed than was necessary. He did not desire strange delights, like blue wine, or black women with Baudelaire, or cruel sights east of Suez with Mr. Kipling. He wanted what a healthy man wants, only he was ill with wanting it. To understand him, in a word, we must keep well in mind the medical distinction between delicacy and disease. Perhaps we shall comprehend it and him more clearly if we think of a woman rather than a man. There was much that was feminine about Dickens, and nothing more so than this abnormal normality. A woman is often, in comparison with a man, at once more sensitive and more sane. This abnormal normality. Gentlemen, this is what confounds us about women. They can be so well grounded, and they look at us and our foolishness as mere flights of fancy. And yet they are so sensitive to everything we say and do. But their sensitivity is an abnormal normality. And I hope that I have not offended any of you dear ladies out there. For as you know, I was exceedingly fond of women, and my female characters had strength and dignity, every one of them, including the ones who are hopeless and lost and wandering. Well, let's do one or two more, and then I'm going to wrap it up. Yes, sir.
18, A Christmas Carol.
18, A Christmas Carol. The beauty and the blessing of the story do not lie in the mechanical plot of it, the repentance of Scrooge, probable or improbable. They lie in the great furnace of real happiness that glows through Scrooge and everything around him. The great furnace, the heart of Dickens. He means the atmosphere of that story, the great joy, whether you believe the probability of the plot or not, the great joy of the ordinary, the great beauty of the poor, the great happiness of repentance comes from that great furnace, the heart of Dickens. Only the heart of a great man would say anything like that. I'll do one or two more. Yes, ma'am?
14.
14, which is?
Dickens and Joy.
Dickens and Joy. This is a short one. In everybody, there is a certain thing that loves babies, that fears death, that likes sunlight, and that thing enjoys Dickens. Yes, ma'am?
35, The Tavern at the End of the World.
Well, we'll end with this. 35, the tavern at the end of the world. Chesterton at times rises to a mystical level. This is, you might say, his paradiso. The hour of absinthe is over. We shall not be much further troubled with the little artists who found Dickens too sane for their sorrows and too clean for their delights. But we have a long way to travel before we get back to what Dickens meant. And the passage is along a rambling English road, a twisting road such as Mr. Pickwick traveled. But this, at least, is part of what he meant. That comradeship and joy are not interludes in our travel, but that rather our travels are interludes in comradeship and joy, which through God shall endure forever. The inn does not point to the road. The road points to the inn, and all roads point at last to an ultimate inn, where we shall meet Dickens and all his characters. And when we drink again, it shall be from the great flagons in the tavern at the end of the world. You see, our life is this ongoing journey, but the journey merely interrupts the communion. That's what he's saying. I did not understand communion. I was not Catholic. I was not particularly religious. And yet the Catholic faith did hold an interest for me. Now, when I found out that Chesterton became Catholic, had I known that during my lifetime, I would have been repulsed by it. No, indeed. Because in my travels through Europe, I experienced both the beauty of the Catholic faith and really the ugliness of what I would call the Catholic culture. I wrote, in fact, after coming through Switzerland, I crossed a river from a Catholic canton to a Protestant one. And I wrote on the difference between the two. I just simply crossed over. It was a river, Protestant on the side I was in, Catholic on the other. And I wrote on the Protestant side, neatness, cheerfulness, industry, education, continual aspiration, at least after better things. And on the Catholic side, dirt, disease, ignorance, squalor, and misery. But somehow, especially in Italy, it had an impact on me that I could not quite put into words. And everything I'm telling you is true and can be found in biographies of me. You see, during one of these trips to Italy, I was in bed one night toward dawn, and I had a dream, or perhaps it was a vision, a waking dream. I had told you about my longing for that one friend I never had, for the one woman that I wanted to love and could never quite find. A woman appeared before me, in my room. I was in bed, I opened my eyes. She was the most beautiful woman I had ever seen. She was dressed in blue and white. She looked like a Madonna from a picture by Raphael. And she looked at me, her face filled with sorrow and pity, and yet compassion and desire for me. I don't know how long the visit lasted, but I was so afraid it would end. I didn't know who she was. Her face looked like no one I had ever seen. Her stature was a human stature, but I did not know her. And then I realized she would leave me. And so I cried out. I describe all of this in a letter to my friend Forster. I cried out to her. I said, before you leave me, give me some token to remember you by. Give me something that I may recall this visit. And she merely looked at me, her face warming all the more with this mixture of compassion and sorrow and pity and love. And she said nothing. And it occurred to me that I could ask for something, the way you do in a fairy story, you see. I said, tell me at least this. What is the true religion? And she did not answer. I said, tell me, is it the Roman Catholic faith? For at least with all that is wrong with it, it excites one more. It brings one closer to God in a way that the others do not. Is that the best religion? Or are all religions the same? You must tell me, tell me. And she spoke. And she said to me, for you, the Catholic faith is the best. And then I woke up. My eyes were streaming tears. I was weeping. Dawn was breaking. And I didn't know if I had been dreaming or awake. And I had no idea who this was until I realized. It was Mary. Mary Hogarth, my sister-in-law, who had died so many years prior at age 17 in my arms, whose ring I took off her lifeless finger and wore until the day I died. My great love, Mary. It was my sister-in-law. Or so I thought then. Now, I know differently. Now I know the truth. I'm not going to say much about where I am now and where I will go when I leave Rochester. Many of you perhaps pray for me. Am I in the inferno? Am I in purgatorio, paradiso? Hell, purgatory, heaven? I will tell you this much. I have been reading the books of G.K. Chesterton, and you cannot find Chesterton's books in hell. Because Chesterton always leads us to the light. It is the light that the darkness cannot overcome. It is the light that will reveal everything that is hidden about our lives now, including our shameful sins. They will be brought to the light. They will be purged, purified, and made clear. And if anyone makes that clear to us, it is our friend, G.K. Chesterton.